helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elim Counselling Services.
Hi, I'm Michael Hart, director of Elim Counselling Services, a Christian counseling ministry in Ottawa. And I want to thank you for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, a Christian counseling radio show where chains are broken and lives are transformed. If you're not familiar with Elim, you can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com, and Elim is spelled E-L-I-M as in man, counseling with 2 L's, ministry.com. And we are a professional counseling center that provides Christian counseling, professional counseling from a Christian perspective. And today we have another interesting show lined up for you. We are continuing the episode from last week in which we were dealing with the burden of burnout. And as I said last week, the title was Melissa's suggestion, and Melissa is here again to help us talk about this important topic. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be back. And as you said last week, we got into the topic of burnout. And really all we had time for last week was just to discuss what burnout is with some biblical examples and things that the listeners could look out for in their own lives to maybe identify if they or someone they love is experiencing a burnout. And so for today's show, what we're going to talk about really is how to come out of burnout. But before we get to that topic and that discussion, do you mind just recapping a little bit about what we discussed last week, starting with the biblical example we used of someone who experienced burnout?
Yes, so for a biblical example, last week we used the life of Elijah. And we saw that Elijah in the book of Kings, First King, had a very stressful occupation. Your occupation can't be more stressful than when people that you're working amongst is trying to kill you. So he was actually fleeing for his life most of the time.
That's a pretty high stress job.
Yes, and I see that there are some of the quality of his job, or the environment in which he was working, was also highly stressful because he had to be hiding all the time, which meant that he was in isolation. He also had a lot of opposition, where there were other prophets that had different point of view. So there was a lot of conflict with others, and there might be people listening to this show today or listening to the show last week that's saying, yes, even though my life might not be in jeopardy, I feel like I'm in isolation at work, and I feel like there's a lot of stress and challenges and confrontation with others. So sometimes those can be some of the factors leading to burnout. But let me recap by just reading the scripture from 1 King 19, and it's verse 3, where it says, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. Verse 4, while he himself went a day's journey into the desert, he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Verse 5, then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. So Elijah came to this point in his work where he said, I have had enough. And this image, this picture of the mighty man of God lying under a tree, praying to God to take his life and saying, enough, I have had enough. It's a very, very sad image of a mighty man. And I think burnout brings very ambitious people, very successful people with a lot of talent and potential to this point where their bodies are actually shutting down and saying, I have had enough. I just can't continue at the pace at which I have been going.
And last week, aside from talking about the story of Elijah, we also talked about some of the causes and the symptoms people may have when experiencing burnout. Can you just quickly go over a few of them just to provide some context for our next discussion of how to come out of burnout?
Right. So some of the symptoms we talked about, we classify the symptoms under three areas: the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual. And for the physical, we talked about things like insomnia. I don't know if I mentioned that because there's a whole list of things, and I may have mentioned different ones. But some of the physical symptoms are insomnia, the inability to sleep. Sometimes people have persistent headaches. These are usually a physical symptom that a person might be heading into burnout. General fatigue, someone who is usually high energy suddenly have a feeling, or not suddenly but maybe over a period of time, starts to feel fatigue, low energy, and having this lack of desire. Then the emotional states, we see people who were previously very interested in their work and enthusiastic about their work, developing a sense of apathy towards their work, or this sense of aversion to work that they once loved. These are some of the symptoms. I won't go into all emotional symptoms, but you can listen to the last week podcast to hear more about emotional symptoms. Then intellectual symptoms, we can talk about things like forgetfulness, where a person who has very good memory and is very knowledgeable about aspects of their work starts becoming forgetful, or start making mistakes that were not previously made. And I think, again, you can hear more about some of the intellectual symptoms by listening to last week's episode.
And I think the other thing, just before we begin our discussion of how to come out of burnout that we talked about last week, was we use the term work very loosely. In the sense, I know some people, when you hear work, you think of a 9-to-5 job or whatever your shift may be. But we described, even in the story of Elijah, he was in ministry, he wasn't paid. We've talked about things like parents that stay at home and are working, but they can become burned out, though they're not in a typical office environment. Or even, we brought up last week, I believe, volunteering in the church sometimes. When you give your time, and you too can develop these symptoms of burnout.
Absolutely, because in church setting we see people who are very enthusiastic about the work of God and has this sense of vision and sense of calling for aspects of ministry, and sometimes it's this fire, this passion that people have that drives them towards burnout. When you look at Elijah, he was very passionate about the things of God, and I think it's this zealousness that sometimes put us at risk for burnout. So people in church settings who are, zealous about God, zealous about the things of God, are sometimes prone to have burnout, even though they might be volunteer staff members or they might just be volunteers. It's possible that they could overwork themselves to the point where they could suffer a burnout. So burnout is not limited to 8-to-5 jobs or to jobs for which people are paid. We know that this can happen even in things like stay-at-home moms who are 24/7 looking after young ones. There is the possibility of burnout there as well.
And so if someone, maybe from listening to last week's podcast, started to identify some of the symptoms of burnout and maybe the stages, and if you can briefly touch on those too, what steps should these people take to start coming out of burnout? I guess the first part to probably start is the stages.
Yes, so let's touch on the stages quickly. And again, and I refer to last week's show. The stage 1 that we talked about last week was stress arousal, where people start becoming irritable. They may be developing high blood pressure, insomnia, and so forth. That is the stress arousal state. But then we have also the energy conservation stage, which is the second stage, where it's as if mentally they are starting to shut down and the body and the mind is saying, I need a break. So people start turning up late for work, sleeping in where previously they were always on time, forgetting things, procrastinating, putting things off. These are all part of the second stage, where the body and the mind is actually starting to conserve energy. And then the final stage, which is the chronic stage, where people start having chronic fatigue to the point where they cannot continue working anymore, or they start having stomach problems and or chronic headaches that makes them unable to function. So those are the stage. And then I think your second question was about what. Could you repeat the second question?
Yeah, so the second piece is, so if people have been listening and they're saying, okay, I'm in stage 1, 2, or 3, wherever it may be, how can I get myself out of this? Or how can I help my loved one come out of this? What advice would you give?
Okay, so there are a number of different things that I would say first of all, to the person who is going through burnout. I would say, if you're seeing any of the symptoms that we have talked about, it's very important to begin to stop and to take stock of what your involvements are, what are the challenges of your job, in what are your tasks, and to see whether or not you are at a point where you're overexerting yourself. So take an inventory, make a list, and see which things on the list you're worried about, which things on the list create stress, which things on the list can be delegated to others. And so I think the first step to do would be to take stock of your activities, your involvement, and to begin to see what can be let go, what can be delegated, what is not really high priority right now that maybe could be put on the side burner. And I think the intent of all of that is to see where you can begin to release some of the stress that you're feeling from being hyperactive and just on the go all the time. When we look at the story of Elijah, we see that Elijah was constantly on the go. He was constantly hiding. And just before his burnout, as we said last week, we saw that after he had this mighty victory on Mount Carmel, where he had victory over the prophets of Baal, Elijah then ran in front of the chariot into the city. Did he have to run in front of the chariot? That's not something that I think he was advised to do, but he had the strength, and maybe he had a flood of adrenaline as a result of the victory over Baal that made him exert even more energy. So I think we have to take stock and to see what is it that we can let go of. What is it that is really high priority right now? Maybe some things need to be done, some things could be let go of.
And I think from my readings about this, even taking that inventory for those people in the middle of it, doing it slowly and being very methodical and process with it. It's not a race to get the list done. But if you're experiencing that stress and anxiety in a situation, jotting that experience or that event down as a flag, so that the inventory itself doesn't become another stressor. I have to get it done. I have to get this done.
Absolutely.
Look at it as sort of a longer term goal.
Absolutely.
So if someone's then taken an inventory and they've said, maybe the situation at work, this project is really stressing me out, and volunteering in this event that my kids do is really stressing me out, what's the next step from there?
I think once you take that list, you have done that list, then you can begin to take steps to say, well, maybe this activity can be let go. Maybe I don't need to be involved in this. Maybe someone else could take over this responsibility. Maybe, my pastor won't think I'm such of a backslider if I tell him that I cannot do the fundraising dinner. I'm just too fatigued right now. So it's important to begin to see from that list which thing can be let go. So I would say the next active step would be to begin to let go and to cut back on activities and creating, as a result of that, you're doing what is a necessary step to healing from burnout, which is creating downtime, where you're able to step back from task and to rest. And rest is a very important step in helping to overcome burnout. If you're on the go all the time and you're always doing, and not taking time to just rest, then your body will mandate that you take a rest by coming to this point of burnout. As we
see in sort of that stage 3, you talk about where it's chronic fatigue.
Yes.
Do you ever run into situations that when you're trying to get someone to prioritize and they're looking at all the stuff they're doing and but no one else can do it?
Yeah.
I have to do it. How do you break someone out of that that sort of stuck place where they have to do everything?
Well, I go into what I call a reality check for those people who will say, there's no one else who can do it, and if I don't do it, it will never get done, by saying something to the effect of, if you were to have a heart attack tonight and not be able to go into work tomorrow, how do you think this organization would function? And for a lot of people, when you use that kind of reality check, they begin to see that, you know what, if I really had a serious illness or I were to pass away, someone would have to take up the slack. Someone would have to do the things that I think I am the only one that can do. And that's one of the danger of burnout, when people begin to think that they're the only one that can do the tasks that they have to do. And from the story of Elijah, we see that Elijah was in that mindset, because Elijah said to God, if you read the rest of the narrative in 1 Kings 19, he said, I am the only one left. They have killed all your prophets, and now I am the only one left. The problem with that statement is that when God looked at the situation, God said to Elijah, no, Elijah, you're not the only one. I have 7,000 more people like you who are capable of doing the job. So we're never the only one that can do a task. We can train people. There are people that can do some of the things that we do. But a lot of time, people have perfectionist mentality where they feel, I have to do this because no one can do it as well as I can. And sometimes we find the opposite also, where people don't know how to say no. So they feel that they have to continue to say yes to task. So that brings me to a next point, the need to be assertive. So if you're in a situation where, because of your talents, because of your abilities, because of the successes that you have had in past projects, additional tasks keep being added to your list, it's necessary to avoid burnout and to come out of burnout that you put a stop to that, and you say, assert yourself by saying, I can't take on anything else right now. I have to finish these previous tasks before I can commit to anything else. So if you have just joined us, you're listening to the Life Transformation Radio Show. I'm your host, Michael Hart of Elim Counselling Services. Elim is spelled E-L-I-M, counseling with 2 L's. Ministry.com is our website, elimcounselingministry.com, and you can also contact us by phone at 613-699-1677. Again, 613-699-1677. And we are here today discussing the burden of burnout, part 2. Part 2 is actually dealing with how to come out of burnout and what are some of the things that you can do if you're in a workplace situation where you're beginning to feel, not a workplace, but in a situation, because as we said, Melissa, it could be a volunteer situation as well, or maybe just a stay-at-home mom. We're talking about things that you can do in order to overcome burnout.
So one of the things you're just discussing there is saying no. Another strategy I've heard is delegating to someone, which I think for some people can actually be a bit of a challenge.
Yes.
So do you have any tips for people on delegating, how to do it, things they should consider?
Yes, so I think in delegating responsibility, if you're of the mindset that the persons that you have to delegate this task to might not be able to do it as well as you, then you can put check and balances in place where you could delegate the task and then you could do a quick review of the task. Or if you delegate tasks to one person who you feel is not as capable, then you could have someone else who is in a position to oversee it or to review the task, do that review so that you don't have to take on that burden. So delegating you can be tricky at times because, as I said before, people sometimes have the mindset that they're the only one. But I'm sure that if you think about it, there are others who you might be able to train. There are others who can do things to a very high level if you give them the chance. So when we come to mothers at home who suffer burnout, we see the same kind of mentality. If I tell them to dust the house, it will never be dusted the way that I want it done, and then I'm going to have to turn around and do it anyway. Or if I tell him to do the dishes, it's not going to be put away properly, so I have to do the dishes. If I tell him to do the laundry, it's not going to be done properly, so I have to do the laundry. So in delegating responsibility, the secret there is not to take over the responsibility if someone else is not doing it well enough. The secret is to train and retrain, and to keep assigning the task to people until they're able to get it perfectly. And it might be necessary to live with some imperfections for a time, because sometimes people don't delegate because they feel that, if it is not done perfectly, then it's a failure. So that's a perfectionist mentality that sometimes is behind a lot of burnout. People who are in burnout has to learn to let that go, to say, yes, the task might not be done perfectly, but it will be done, or others can do it to a satisfactory level.
And just let it go as best you can.
Let it go.
As the song says.
Yes.
As the song says. The other thing I've heard is, and I've experienced this myself a little bit, is sometimes you need a bit of a break from the work.
Yes.
And you need something else to kind of take your mind off the day-to-day stressors. Is that something you've seen as being successful in your practice?
Absolutely. I think our mind needs a break from the doing the same thing over and over. And what is very... one of the problems of today is that people are more and more people are having burnout because they are constantly connected to the work environment. For people who have 9-to-5 jobs, they come home and then they're sent emails and they have to respond to emails, or they come home, but because they have access to information at work, they have to prepare for a meeting, or they have to finish a project that has to be handed in on Monday, so they have to be working on the project during the weekend. I think that's a recipe for burnout, a recipe for disaster, because your mind cannot be going on the same thing over and over and over again. Eventually your mind will shut down, you'll begin to become forgetful, you will start having headaches, and all those symptoms that we talk about will start kicking in automatically to say to you, you need to take a break. So one of the way of overcoming burnout is to have a hobby. Have something that you do that will take away your focus from what it is that is your daily living, or that occupies you most of the time. So things like learning to play an instrument, if that's not what you do for a living, taking up a hobby, maybe signing up for a marathon, take on something else that will help to distract your mind so that you don't get to that stage where you're constantly thinking about everything. So we see in Elijah's situation that Elijah was consumed because of his passion for God. He was consumed with overcoming the prophets of Baal. And from the narrative that we have, it was an endless task for him, day after day, year after year, of doing the same thing to promote the kingdom of God and to overcome the prophets of Baal.
He needed a break. He needed a hobby.
He needed a hobby.
Another thing I think, and I've tried to do this in my own life, is when you have big projects or big things going on, taking breaks between them.
Yes.
There's nothing worse than you have the meeting on Monday, the project due on Tuesday, the thing on Wednesday. Do you find that effective for helping with burnout too, or preventing it?
That's a very good strategy as well. And sometimes people become burnout because they are constantly on the go, going from one big task to another, And this is kind of the narrative that we have in the book of First King, where the life of Elijah is concerned, where we see that Elijah, it was just from one thing to another, one thing to another. So I think, as you said, taking breaks between projects. Like if you have done a big project that consumed a lot of your mental focus, a lot of your energy, it's necessary to say, I can't take another project right now. I just need a break to recover from that stress of doing that. So that takes us to what happened if you're in a situation which a go situation where you're always been pushed by by the boss and you don't have a choice. I think that's where maybe assertiveness can come in, where you need to create a situation, to have a conversation where you can say, look, I'm really very stressed, very exhausted as a result of what I have just done, and I just need this day in between, or these 2 days in between, before I can focus on something else right now.
Mm-hmm. The other piece, I think, and you alluded to it a little bit with the fact that now our work is 24/7, 365. Our iPhones beep at night and all those fun things. Have you seen how electronic devices or just the gadgets in our life have started to contribute to burnout? Is that something you've seen?
Absolutely, because I think with the gadgets becomes create situation like lack of sleep. I talk to couples who one spouse will say she's always or he's always on his iPad. He's always responding to email. We're at dinner and his iPhone is going off. He's been called, he's been sent emails. And so I think the accessibility that these devices create prevents us from doing some of these things that we talk about, like taking a break, right? It's from one thing to another. So one of the strategy, I think, is to turn off those devices. After a big project, turn off the devices that keeps you connected. Because if you don't, you are going to just be on the go. And I think it's sad that couples today can't have a dinner. A lot of couples can't have a dinner without there being a call coming in or an email that has to be answered, and it just creates this constant on the go that creates burnout. And I think finally, I see my signal from my producer that I have to wrap up here, but I think finally I'd like to say that it's very important to find time to meditate on things that can give you a sense of peace and calmness. I think there are passages of the word of the Bible, for example, that are very conducive to that kind of creation of peace. Meditate on the word of God that brings you peace. Find time alone to pray, and I think things like that are very, very good in helping to prevent burnout. So Melissa, unfortunately, we have come to today's show, but I think we have covered quite a bit in terms of overcoming burnout, and thank you very much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
If you're listening to us today and you have a question or a topic you'd like to have discussed, please feel free to give us a call at 613-699-1677. You can also contact us by email on our website at elimcounselingministry.com, Elim counseling with 12 ministry.com. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Life Transformation radio broadcast. Until next time, this is your host, Michael Hart, praying that God would grant you happiness in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart. God bless you, and thank you very much for listening.